Greetings. Welcome to the Department of African and African Diaspora Studies Department Seminar at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. We are delighted to have you with us and also the support of our many co-sponsors. But time is short, so on to our event. We are grateful to have Noam Chomsky with us. I will not use much time in rehearsing Noam's innumerable professional achievements, but I will remark on the long arc of his commitment to social justice, of which on the opposite side of the ledger perhaps is only rivaled by Henry Kissinger at 97 years of age. But Noam has been the tortoise to Kissinger's hare. So Henry, if you're listening, I think Noam won the race. But each side has also passed on their batons. And so the work continues, and Noam continues to help row us forward. Now, also joining us in conversation is Patrick Bellegarde-Smith, an emeritus professor of our department, who is a Haitian historian and political economist. Of his many books on Haiti, Noam wrote of Patrick's Breached Citadel that there is no better starting point than this learned and penetrating inquiry. I wholeheartedly agree. Speaking of long arcs, I have known both gentlemen for longer than half my life. Noam, more than he knows, was key in encouraging my intellectual and political work on both the political economy of the US occupation of Haiti, but also on my work with austerity policies in the Baltic states and the collapse of the Soviet Union. Patrick played the same role with my above referenced work on the US and Haiti and has been a sounding board and mentor on all matters large and small since we met in the mid-1980s. Myself, I am faculty in this department and visiting professor at the Stockholm School of Economics in Riga. So let's begin. Noam, I have a couple of questions for you, and we'll see what we get through, and then if time permits, perhaps we can field some questions from the registrants for our event as well. But thinking about that theme of the long arc of social change, I'd like us to think a little bit about the present and the future. And have you reflect on where you think we are and what our prospects are. As you know, in the past century, we had various both obstacles and headwinds that shaped the degree to which we could go forward in terms of social change. I guess in terms of, just those tailwinds, we had the Soviet Union, for one, in the Cold War, which kind of matched the internal pressures from activism for change, especially on civil rights, but also on other spheres as well. Of course, we no longer have that alternative system that works to help propel those social movements forward. We've also, though, become a society that is far more unequal, and especially since the financial crisis of 2008, one which has created further social and economic divides, which perhaps helps to move forward again or to provide fuel for activism. What are your thoughts on this topic, both where we are and where we might be going?
So in a minute, what has happened in the last century? Okay, easy task. So I'll be very cursory, of course. For me, the century began 90 years ago. So I grew up in the Depression, and the rise of fascism over the world. That's my childhood background. Looked at the time as if fascism was going to spread inexorably. Seemed to be no limits. It was frightening. At home, my family was first generation, unemployed working class, much worse conditions in the Depression than anything in recent years, but it was very hopeful. Unlike now, this is a period of despair, so on. The 30s, much worse, not for dirt farmers in the Middle West, but in, say, New York, working class. There was a sense that we're going to get out of this together. A lot of solidarity. Unions were organizing, CIO organizing, sympathetic administration, horrible now, but things are going to get better. That was the feeling, except for the rise of fascism in Europe, which was very frightening, especially for Jewish community, which I was in. I didn't know then, of course, but I knew now we've learned since that US planners who were seeing the world much the same way, from 1939 to 45, there were high-level planning meetings. Their deliberations are now public. At the beginning, the early years, they assumed that the war would end with a bipolar world, the United States and Germany. They assumed that Nazi Germany would control most of Eurasia, and the United States would control the rest, displacing Britain as the global hegemon. And from the planners' point of view, partly from our own point of view, that changed at the time of Stalingrad and then the great tank battle in Kursk, 1943, which made it pretty clear that the Russians were going to defeat the Germans, which in fact is what happened. Almost the entire war was on the Eastern Front. By the end of the war, 1945, there was a mood of kind of radical democracy that spread over much of the world in the period of the Depression and the war, feeling all over the world. And in 1945, the US emerged as by far the most powerful country in history, certainly the most powerful that existed. Every other industrial country had been severely damaged or destroyed. The US economy had boomed during the war. Manufacturing production almost quadrupled. There was a lot of pent-up demand, so there was good chance for economic growth in the future, but the US had maybe almost half the wealth of the world. Statistics weren't very good then, but that's a common rough estimate. Total control, total security, controlled the entire Western Hemisphere, both oceans, the opposite sides of both oceans. There was a lot of talk about the Russian menace. That's a fake. And the Russians were barely able to recover from the war. We could go into the details. I should say at this point that I think the Cold War has been seriously misconceived. I always thought that from the beginning. The Cold War was real, but what it was a tacit, unspoken, maybe even unrecognized partnership between a huge superpower and a much smaller power, United States and Russia, each granting the right to the other to do whatever it wanted in its own domains. You don't interfere much. For the United States, that meant almost the entire world. But for Russia, it meant Eastern Europe. So the US didn't interfere much in atrocities that Russia carried out in Eastern Europe. Russia didn't interfere in the much worse atrocities that we carried out all over the world. A little bit, but not very much. And that was the Cold War. Cold War ended 1990. Basically, the US has the whole business. It's interesting to see what happened then. As far as social policy in the United States went, it's convenient to break it into two periods. There was a period of what's sometimes called regimented capitalism, starting from the New Deal up through the 50s and the 60s. Basically, a residue of the New Deal policies that were being chipped away very quickly after the war by a major business offensive. But it more or less remained in force through the 50s, through the 60s. Then starting in late 70s, Reagan and since, it's the period of neoliberalism. And neoliberalism is essentially a giveaway to the rich and the powerful. Say, take what you like. That's essentially neoliberalism. It was, I should say, the 50s and the 60s were the greatest growth period in the history of American capitalism. Also, it was fairly egalitarian growth. The lowest quintile grew about as fast as the highest quintile. There were sectors left out. Blacks were left out, just as in the New Deal, blacks had to be left out. Otherwise, nothing would pass through the Southern Democrats' veto on legislation. So federal law required segregation in federally supported housing, which meant the huge, mostly government-supported housing boom in the 50s, early 60s, left out the Black population. There were opportunities for blacks. A black worker could get a decent job in the auto industry, but they couldn't accumulate wealth. That's very critical. Wealth in the United States means mostly property ownership. And the white working class could gain wealth from the Levitowns and others, but not the blacks. Federal law blocked it into the 60s. Many other restrictions. Through the 50s and the 60s, there was a growing civil rights movement. I can't go through the details, but finally by 1963, 64, there were some gains, limited, but some gains. And by then it was too late to cash in on the wealth accumulation. That has a big consequence up till today. But there were gains. By the 60s, a lot of activism developed, had a big impact on the society. Lots of things broke through that had been concealed. One of them is recognition of the extermination of the native population, one of the huge crimes on which the United States is built. Totally unknown in the 60s, even in academic scholarship. The story was a bunch of, maybe a few hunter-gatherers scattered around, but basically nothing. We now know that we're advanced civilizations. The extermination was calculated, understood by the founding fathers and their successors. They were talking openly about the need to extirpate, exterminate the quite advanced and indigenous population. One of the main reasons for the American Revolution was the 1763 declaration of King George III banning the colonists from invading the Indian nations, as they were called, west of the Appalachians. Colonists weren't having that. They wanted to expand. Certainly great land speculators like George Washington didn't want to be inhibited from moving west. So the end of the revolution, and when the revolution succeeded, that opened up the possibility for invading the Indian nations and moving towards what they called the extirpation and extermination of the indigenous population, leading finally to true genocide in California at the end of the century. None of that was known, none, but it broke through in the 60s, outside the academic world, finally seeped back in. Same is true of the history of slavery, barely known. Started activism in the 60s, opened some of the doors, went on. By now, a lot is known, not all. In fact, one of the most important books on slavery just came out a couple of years ago with the very apt title, The Half Had Never Been Told. That was true up to a couple of years ago, Edward Baptiste's book. By now, lots of things are known. The culture changed enormously. Women's rights finally began to be recognized. Until 1975, women were not legally persons. They did not have the rights of peers. Supreme Court, 1975, determined that women have the right to, the technical issue is, do they have the right to serve on federal juries? But what that meant is they are now legally peers, not property, the way they were under the English common law that was taken over in the early years of the country. So lots of things changed. Meanwhile, business was carrying out a very dedicated offensive, quite extreme when you look into the details, to try to cut back the New Deal heresy and to return the country to the kind of almost total business control that it had in the 1920s. That finally took place by the late 70s, finally Reagan. When Reagan came in, all you had to do was look to predict the future, was to watch what's happening, what they're saying. Reagan and Thatcher, their first acts were to destroy labor unions immediately. First acts of both Reagan and Thatcher. They knew exactly what they were doing. Not Reagan, but whoever was thinking for him and telling him what to say. Thatcher probably understood herself. First thing you have to do is destroy the labor movement. That's the defense of working people against business class war, which is unremitting, never stops. So you have to eliminate the defense. Then you get the proclamations. Reagan, the government is the problem, not the solution. That doesn't mean that decisions go away. They're just shifted somewhere else. They're shifted from the government, which is partially responsive to the public, into the hands of totalitarian private tyrannies called corporations, which are totally unaccountable to the public. So you move decision-making to their hands. Thatcher's version is there's no society, only individuals thrown into the market to survive somehow. But of course, the rich and powerful and growing financial institutions, they're exempt from that. Then you have the economic guru, Milton Friedman, whose doctrine is corporations have only the responsibility to enrich themselves. A corporation is a gift from the taxpayer. If you incorporate, you're getting a gift from the taxpayer. That's why people incorporate instead of forming partnership. But you have no responsibility, according to neoliberal doctrine. It's called libertarian for some reason in the United States, term straight out of Orwell. So hand decisions over to unaccountable private tyrannies whose sole goal is to enrich themselves. Okay, it's about all you have to know to see what happened for the last 40 years. There's actually a recent study by the Rand Corporation, very reputable corporation, study of how much money was, as they put it, transferred, as we should say, robbed from the lower 90% of the population, the working class and most of the middle class, how much was transferred from them to the super rich, which if you look closely means top fraction of 1%. Now their estimate is close to $50 trillion, which is a serious underestimate. It doesn't take into account that when Reagan came in, whoever was telling him what to do told him, open the spigots, let the corporate world do whatever it feels like. Well, one of the things they were allowed to do was set up tax havens. That had been barred under the previous law, and Treasury Department, which used to be a real department, actually enforced the law. But with, you open the door to tax havens, a lot of it's secret, but what is known is it's probably tens of trillions of dollars more, and many other things. So the effect for the general population is stagnation. Real wages, male wages, are lower than they were in 1979. A large part of the population, probably a substantial majority, are pretty much living from paycheck to paycheck, precarious jobs, no unions, no way of defense, has an effect. The effect is all over the world. Europe had its own version. In Europe, it was compounded by the austerity programs forced in by the German banks, which made it even worse. Europe also had even more undermining of democracy than here. The European Union was set up in such a way that decisions are made, crucial decisions are made by an unelected bureaucracy in Brussels. European Commission, unelected, IMF, obviously European Central Bank, Troika. Decisions are taken out of the hands of governments where people have some influence, put in the hands of an unelected bureaucracy. Of course, the democratic process deteriorates. All of this happens in one form or another all over the world, wherever the neoliberal plague extended for pretty obvious reasons. Well, result right in front of our eyes, things like January 6th. That's a result. When people are justly, rightly angry, resentful, hating institutions, all with complete justice, fertile terrain for demagogues, very fertile terrain, and happens to be a genius here who understands exactly how it works, a skilled con man, was able to carry out the very impressive feat of shafting the working class and the middle class at every turn. You look at the legislative program, sheer robbery of the poor, the working class, and middle class. He was able to do that at the same time while he was able to mobilize many of them in adoring, worshipful fealty to the chosen one, as he called himself, came down from heaven. It's a pretty significant achievement. He finally made a mistake. On January 6th, he went too far. And the big guys, the guys who own the country, told him, "You're finished, out, goodbye." He left. The senators started running for the exits. McConnell and the rest of them, when the Chamber of Commerce, National Association of Manufacturers, CEO of Goldman Sachs, tells them the game's over, the game's over. So they notice the senators who depend on corporate contributions, the House is less so. You can buy a House election for much less money. So, and the senators are now stuck. They're racing for the exits because the big guys who own the place are telling them it's over. But when they get near the exits, they run into this rabid, Trump-loving, Marjorie Greene-loving hordes that have been mobilized by the very successful demagogue. An interesting period, if you're looking at it from Mars. How are they going to handle, how's Mitch McConnell going to put this together? He's having trouble. The Democrats, meanwhile, are split between the Clintonite, Wall Street-oriented neoliberals who run the party, Democratic National Committee, and the popular forces who are pounding on the doors and pushing in the other direction. They're kind of split too. But institutions have severely declined. Similar things happening in Europe. The old parties that ran the place forever, center left, center right, have almost disappeared. By now it's fringes. Social Democrats in Germany, venerable party, go back to the 19th century, almost gone. Similar things are happening in much of the world. Brazil, biggest country, Western Hemisphere outside of here, is in the hands of a neo-fascist maniac who's destroying the country. And he still has some support, despite the fact that he's killing lots of people with his pandemic lunacy, denying things and so on. And one or another form of this is happening. Trump is sometimes, tell me if I'm going on too long, I'll end in a minute, just last comment. Trump is accused, or whoever's behind Trump is accused of not having a geostrategic plan. It's not quite true. They had a very clear geostrategic policy to create a reactionary international of the most backward, reactionary, cruel states in the world, run by Washington as a base for American power. And they significantly achieved it, including some of the things that are praised by liberals who either don't care or don't see what's happening. The big achievement for which Kushner has been nominated for the Nobel Prize by the great libertarian Alan Dershowitz. It's a real comic opera when you look at the world now. The big achievement is the Abraham Accords. What is the Abraham Accords? It's taking tacit relations that existed for a long time among the most reactionary, brutal states of the Middle East and forming an overt alliance among them. That's the Gulf dictatorships, the most brutal reactionary states in the world. Israel's moved so far to the right, you need a telescope to see it, crushing the Palestinians. Egypt, under the worst dictatorship they've ever had in their history. The family dictatorship in Morocco, which is quite important for reasons that aren't discussed much, but you should think about them. Potassium is essential for agriculture, and it's not replaceable. There's no sustainable alternative. Most of the potassium is in Morocco and Western Sahara, which Morocco conquered in violation of UN Security Council orders. Previously with the tacit agreement of the United States, under Trump with the open agreement. Crucial part of the Abraham Accords was to authorize Morocco's conquest of the Western Sahara, the last colony in Africa. So that's brought in. And all of this is welded together as a base for US power. Nobel Peace Prize, please. Perfect. Greatest alliance since the Axis. Add to it Modi's India, perfect members, crushing Indian secular democracy, turning India into a Hindu ethnic state, crushing Kashmir, Orban in Hungary, Salvini in Italy, other nice guys around the world. That's a serious achievement. And the Democrats are buying into it. You can see it. I promised to end, so I'll stop. But you see it very clearly in the what's going on with Iran right now, about which there's a lot to say. Sorry, went on too long.
No worries. And we certainly, no need to respond to this, but we certainly have to be concerned with the foreign policy team that Biden has put together with Blinken and Samantha Powers, et cetera. It's going to be a challenging time, I think, for us who are interested in keeping the United States at home rather than abroad. Patrick, I know that you had two questions, and just in the interest of time, I'm wondering if you can collapse them into one, because I think they actually go together. So Patrick?
Yes, I will put them into one. I was pleased that you mentioned the Nobel Prize because the Black Lives Movement has been nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize. And going forward, what are the lessons of the Black Power movement and the Black Lives Movement, the rights and the wrongs of it? But looking at the greater picture, looking at the grand scheme of things, what are the limits and the potential of identity politics in the United States? And these are some of the things that I'm concerned about. And I recall that Albert Lutuli in South Africa, King in the US, certainly Mandela, had a great deal of resistance when they were given the Nobel Prize of Literature, of Peace. And I suspect that BLM will not get it for the same reasons, because there is resistance building.
For me?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, there is identity politics is a major stream in U.S. life. The major component of identity politics is white supremacy. That's the most significant, in power, overwhelmingly important element of identity politics. It's a deep current in American life. It's a poison right below the surface. Part of Trump's genius as a con man was to tap all of the poisons that run right below the surface of American life, bring them to the top, use them as the way to focus the anger and resentment that's coming from destruction of most of the population. White supremacy is one. By now, I mean, since Nixon, it's been the theme of the Republican Party. Nixon, also a canny politician, understood that the Southern Democrats are going to leave the Democratic Party, where they had enormous power, because the Democrats were supporting mild, very mild civil rights for Afro-Americans after merely 400 years of torture. They couldn't take that, so they were there, and Nixon's Southern strategy was, okay, let's bring them in to a Republican Party, which is pretty openly racist, hardly conceals it. Nixon, it was clear. Ronald Reagan made it explicit. His opening, you will recall, of course you do, that he opened his 1980 campaign in a town that people knew of only for one reason, Philadelphia, Mississippi. Only one thing anybody knew about that town: 3 civil rights workers were murdered there. Okay, that's where you open your campaign. They made up all sorts of pretexts, but that's what happened. Then started the stories about rich black women driving in their limousines to the welfare office to steal your hard-earned money. And then the rest of the Reaganite racist tropes. With him, it was pretty deep. So, for example, Reagan was the last world figure to support South African racism, apartheid. Even Thatcher, even Israel had withdrawn support. Reagan held on to the last day, got to support apartheid. There's no repression. It's just a tribal war. There's the white tribes and the Zulu tribes and so on. They can't get together, but there's no other problem. In fact, in 1968, last days of the apartheid, 88, last days of the apartheid regime, the Reagan administration declared the African National Congress, Mandela's ANC, to be one of the more notorious terrorist groups in the world. That remained. Mandela was not permitted to come to the United States, except with special dispensation, until I think about 2008, when Congress did pass something saying he wasn't a leading world terrorist. I mean, there's nothing in the world like this. I mean, it's just off the spectrum. And that continues. Trump's picked it up, and like other ugly features of the society, he's managed to expand it and make it quite open. So the Republicans are now a white supremacist party, pretty openly. That's identity politics with a vengeance, and very significant, enormous impact. And you can kind of understand it. You travel through rural America, where it's mostly based. The towns are destroyed. The shop windows are closed. The church closed. Young people are leaving. There's no economy because of the neoliberal globalization problems, which devastated the economy. People want their old America back. Old America, where colored people knew their place, didn't bother us. It was white, Christian, often evangelical, traditional families. Families were friendly, knew each other, pleasant environment. We want that back. And they are stealing it away from us. They, meaning the urban centers with Blacks and Hispanics and gays and lesbians and all these crazy people. They're stealing our country from us. All that's tied into white supremacy. And you put yourself in that mentality. You can believe that the election was stolen, as majority of Republicans do. You imagine it? Doesn't matter that they lost by 7 million votes. That goes through every court, even right-wing courts. They throw it out with derision. It's all just the deep state trying to steal our country from us. You get the mentality, you put yourself in their shoes, you can kind of empathize. Let's attack the Capitol, take it over, and overturn the election. Well, that's identity politics. Then there's the kind that's talked about. You don't talk about the mainstream. That's taken for granted. You talk about things that oppose mainstream power. So Black Lives Matter, which incidentally has become very popular. As I mentioned before, the Black Lives Power movement has far more popular support than Martin Luther King did, even at the peak of his popularity. Tells you something important about the country. Gay rights, it's now pretty well accepted. Into this millennium, there were still anti-sodomy laws. It's pretty recent, but it's changed. Feminist issues, not perfect by any means, but it's changed. So that's what's called identity politics. Now, in fact, it can go too far. Anything can go too far. So you have to be careful about that. You don't want to suppress class issues. There's a real bond between white and black working people, for example. My childhood, during the CIO activist organizing campaigns, blacks and whites who had been at sword points before were working together in solidarity for creating, they went pretty far, not only creating the rights to organize, but threatening to take over factories. You have to remember what it was like. By 1935, they were starting sit-down strikes. Sit-down strikes terrifies the ownership class for good reasons. It's one step before saying, we don't need the bosses. We can run this place by ourselves. Get lost, okay? One step before that. That's when you started to get business accepting New Deal reforms. It's getting dangerous. Peasants are coming with their pitchforks. That's happening right now too, incidentally. You take a look at Business Roundtable, Davos Conference, the organizations of CEOs are coming forward and saying, look, we recognize we haven't treated you guys nicely, meaning the population, for 40 years. We realize our mistakes. We're now going to change. We're going to be working for stakeholders, not for shareholders. You can trust us. We're going to be what in the 1950s were called soulful corporations, corporations who aren't after ourselves, but just work tirelessly for the benefit of the poor and the working class. We're hearing the same refrain now because, again, the peasants are coming with the pitchforks. There's a lot of opposition and they're in danger. They face what they call reputational risks. So we got to take some steps. Bank of America has to stop, say at least they'll stop investing in fossil fuel companies, other things like that. These are signs of the successes of popular activism. They're backing off. And it's very important not to believe the promises. Promises are easy, whether it comes from Obama or soulful corporations or anyone else. You have to keep their feet to the fire or else nothing will happen. You'll go back to the unremitting class war always carried out by the business classes. So we're seeing that. And the Black Lives Matter and the identity politics case that you raise is an interesting one. We should look at it carefully. It is very important for those who are concerned with Afro-American, the horrible Afro-American history and its legacy, rights of gays, lesbians, transgender, others, all important issues. They should not be pushed to the point where they alienate and anger your allies. Your natural allies are other people like you who are working people, who are poor sometimes, who are discriminated against, who have their own concerns and interests, which are the same as yours, basically. And that's what should be focused on, not trying to separate. That's a danger that the best of movements can fall into. Actually, we saw this, interestingly, with the defund the police proposal. The way it was presented, it was an extremely serious proposal, which could get the support of the police, support of suburban communities, very wide support. The original proposals, which the leadership of BLM and Sanders and others Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and others kept pushing was, look, this is a program to remove from police jurisdiction things that oughtn't be there. The police should not be involved in domestic disputes, overdoses, finding lost dogs, and so on. Those are things that should be done by communities, community service organizations. That's what should have been pressed. In fact, Ocasio-Cortez was once asked, what does defund the police mean? And she said, look at any suburban community. If a kid is caught with drugs, he's not sent to jail for the rest of his life. He's sent for therapy, treatment, something, a humane way, goes back into the society. The police don't come in to try to break up a domestic dispute. It's done in other ways. That's defund the police. Let's be humane, okay? Well, that was handed over to the right wing. It was handed over to the Republicans. They ran with it. It was one of Trump's leading campaign funders. He says, these crazy radicals want you to open your home to robbers and rapists, by implication black, and that's what they're trying to do with you. You got to be careful with what you do. You have to be careful to get people to understand what you're talking about, not just wave slogans. Make them understand what you mean. That takes direct organizing on the ground, talking to people, not social media, not internet, out there working with people. And it can be done, places where it's succeeded.
Right. Well, while perhaps sounding a bit extreme, but to make a point, I mean, I think the left, whatever that means, it would behoove ourselves as well to have kind of our own Frank Luntz that works on branding a bit as well. I think you're absolutely right, Noam, regarding the content of Defund the Police. It was really, really solid. And then, of course, it became bumper stickerized, and the right was able to turn it around and use it as a weapon of sorts politically. Just briefly, as a bit of follow-up to Patrick's question and your remarks, Noam, I'm thinking about that issue of class solidarity. And what Dylan Riley has written about in the New Left Review recently, Riley being a sociologist at the University of California at Berkeley. But he's written, I think, very perceptibly about the cleavages within the Democratic Party. On one side, there is this kind of Clintonian Obama wing that looks to improve things on the margins, but it's not really interested in any kind of fundamental change. Is definitely interested in, and this is of course a positive development in terms of opening professions and the middle class and the upper middle class especially to people of greater variety of backgrounds. But more negatively, that that is the upper limit of what they're interested in. So that particular wing of the party is interested in creating social stability through diversifying the upper middle class, but doesn't really have as much interest in advancing things such as the minimum wage, which would perhaps help more people than anything else we could do. And so we see, I think, on the other side of the Democratic Party and to factions on the left of that even, this younger generation of people who became socialized after the 2008 financial crisis. So they are far more in solidarity with an expanded, diverse working class than these kinds of Democrats that I just referenced before. And of course, Sanders was definitely, especially in 2016, but even in 2020, advancing a more universalistic argument. I mean, what are your thoughts on that regarding a way forward politically?
Well, it's as I mentioned, there is a split in the Democratic Party, several splits. You've mentioned more narrow, sharper ones than I mentioned. There is the overall split between the Clintonite neoliberals, which includes Obama. They are willing, in fact, happy to bring in gays, upper middle class blacks, diversify corporate boardrooms and so on. And furthermore, business is perfectly happy with that. I mean, that's their culture anyway. They go home to Hampton Beach. They don't mind gay executives, So yeah, let's openly bring them into the corporate boardrooms. We'll have a scattering of blacks, which from the business point of view has several advantages. For one thing, it makes them look like soulful corporations. For another thing, it draws from the Afro-American population some of the people who could be leading activists, draws them out of that, brings them into the upper middle, into the acceptable, basically white upper middle class. So they're perfectly happy with that. When it goes farther than that, no. We saw it very dramatically with Obama, in fact. Obama was elected with the support of the working class. The white working class supported Obama. They believed the nice rhetoric about hope and change and all that business. Didn't take long for them to be disabused. By 2010, 2 years, when Obama had Congress, he had already lost the working class. 2010 election, they turned against him. It was very striking in Massachusetts, where you recall Ted Kennedy had died and there was a special election to replace him, which the Democrats should have won with a sweep. They lost. Even union voters who weren't voting for the Democratic candidate, Obama had totally betrayed them. The TARP legislation passed under Bush had provided funds for bailout from the financial crisis, which was a consequence of the housing crisis. It was really a housing crisis, which then affected financial markets. So the legislation had two components. One is bail out the criminals who caused the crisis with predatory lending, derivative, fancy instruments to conceal what was happening, all that stuff. So bail them out. They made a ton of money, but let's bail them out because they're in trouble. The other part was help support the victims, the people who lost their homes, foreclosures, lost their jobs, families broke up and so on. Give them some help. Well, didn't take a genius to figure out which part of the legislation was going to be implemented without activist pressure. And there was none, because it had believed Obama and walked away. He'll take care of us. So only the first was implemented. The Inspector General of the Treasury Department, Neil Barofsky, was infuriated, tried to press for the whole business. He was disregarded, finally wrote a very bitter book about it. Working people didn't have to read his book. They could see what was happening in their lives. You don't have to know the details. So later on, the Democrats lost them. Well, that's one part of the Democratic Party. We abandoned the working class. We're now a class of wealthy professionals. We'll allow some blacks and gays and some women and so on, just to make it look like soulful corporations. So we'll allow that, but we're basically the old white rich elite, Wall Street oriented, donor oriented, neoliberal committed, and so on. Then there's the progressive group, the activists, the young people, the ones who are banging at the doors and making a difference. Some of Biden's steps already are quite good. I'm happy that we're all happy that he ended U.S. participation in the grotesque atrocities that going on in Yemen. I hope it's real, but he claims to have ended it, so let's hope. Agreeing with the Russians finally to save the last piece of the arms control regime. Trump had destroyed it all, but one part was left, New START Treaty. It expired today. Today was the expiration date. Biden got in just in time to sign it before it ended. That would have been the end of arms control. That was a good step. There's some positive steps on the labor front. Could go into them. Some good people there. Jared Bernstein, Heather Boucher, a couple of others may make a difference. Climate policy, the Sunrise Movement, other activists have moved it towards certainly the best that there's ever been. Not good enough, but the best there's ever been. If it continues, it could be enough to get us out of this crisis before it destroys us. Those are the good parts. DNC is trying to back off on all of them. And we see it happening right now on the stimulus program. Right what's happening. I mean, Biden came out with a fairly reasonable stimulus program, almost $2 trillion. The Republicans, led by Susan Collins, responded with a completely sadistic program. It's the only word you can use for it. Let's throw out 2/3 of it and let people starve. Nothing for the states and localities, which are crucial for saving people's lives. It's pure sadism. It's taken seriously by the media as an alternative. So then you have to compromise. Well, compromises are going on. So cap the stimulus payments at $75,000 a year or $50,000 a year, way below what's needed. Nothing for the states and localities. At least the Democrats are kind of hanging on to the main part. But you have to understand that they have a real dilemma, and you can't overlook it. If they have to deal with reality. Reality is that half the Senate is in the hands of the sadists, and you can't change that. They're not going to compromise. So if you want to push through other things in the program, you can't ignore Mitch McConnell. He's there. He knows what he's doing. When Obama was elected, McConnell came straight out and said, our primary task is to ensure that Obama can't achieve anything. He said it. Those are approximately his words. Let's make the country ungovernable. Let's make people suffer as much as possible so that things will be rotten and we can come back into office. That's called conservatism these days. Hardly the right word for it, but that's what's called conservatism. It's going to continue. Now in a different way, because probably Trump will set up an alternative government, claim to be the real government, not the fake government in Washington, probably work with McConnell to make sure the country's ungovernable, so the severe problems that are faced won't be faced, and then maybe they can roar back into power. Kind of like what happened with Obama, but now exaggerated because you've got the Trump figure and the rabid support system. I think that's what we may be looking forward to, and how the progressive elements in the Democratic Party deal with this will be very significant.
Right, right. Noam, just a business question here as we are concluding our hour. Do you have time for perhaps a question or two from the participants on our list, or do you have other events to go to? I know you've already put in a long day.
Yeah, I'm afraid I'm going to have to leave after that. I have another appointment.
Sure, sure. Well, with that then, given the fact that we are more or less at the end of our hour, I do want to thank you for your time and a very instructive, illuminating set of comments from you, and also extend my thanks to Patrick Bellegarde-Smith, who was also able to participate in this event with us. So until we correspond again, Noam, thank you very much.
Thank you. Pleasant with you.